Okay, this is a review for Cognition for Exam 1. We'll be covering the topics of 1 through 6 in the PowerPoint slides, and that corresponds to chapters 1 through 3 in the textbook. What we'll be doing here is going through pretty much all of the slides from class with a summary of the information that we discussed within them. So we started off with a basic introduction to cognitive psychology and what it's about, and it has to do with a wide range of human behaviors and essentially anything that we could think of that requires some degree of intelligence. And as we said, it turns out from a scientific standpoint that it's very difficult to understand a lot of these, what seem to be very simple kinds of processes that we carry out without thinking about them every day. Thinking, learning, planning, recognizing, and so on and so forth. These are things we do without much effort, but turn out to be quite difficult to understand, scientifically speaking. And as a way of seeing just how difficult it is, if we look at the progress of artificial intelligence, which is the progress in terms of building machines that can perform intelligent kinds of behavior, we're just not there yet. We'd all love to have a Rosie who can wash our dishes and take out the trash, but we don't have that capacity. We don't have robots that can do lots of the simple, what seem to be simple kinds of tasks that we as humans are able to do. In fact, if we look at a general trend in artificial intelligence, there are certain kinds of tasks which machines are really good at, and in fact, they're better than humans at. So, certain kinds of tasks which require very quick computation, very rapid churning of numbers, or very precise kinds of actions, such as in a factory assembly line. Computers are actually better than humans. They can be much more precise and they can be much faster. The problem with computers in general and with artificial intelligence is that you need to know beforehand exactly what the system is going to do in any situation, and that will tend to break down when you have to deal with novel kinds of situations. So we mentioned Asimo, the robot who climbs stairs. So if you put it on in a real life type of situation where it has to climb stairs, sometimes it'll fail in a way that humans often won't, because it's very hard to pre-program the machine to do things exactly right. So the bottom line is we want flexible, intelligent behavior, not just following predetermined rules. This is basically what we're able to do every moment of every day when you're listening to a conversation, hearing about information you never heard before, encountering a new situation, a new room, a new classroom, a new book you're reading. These are things that you're able to deal with based on your intelligence. But we can't specify some set of pre-programmed rules in order to do it. So how do we do this? And that's the goal of cognitive psychology, trying to understand how this kind of flexible, intelligent behavior is possible. It's the study of the mind and all that it does, or in other words, intelligent behavior. Some areas of research that we'll be covering, so far we've only covered one, is perception. And there's a whole bunch that we'll be covering later in the semester that are involved in what we think of as cognition. And if you recall, we did a brief exercise in class where we imagined certain inventions that would be really nice to have, but that we don't have yet. And the idea of this exercise was just to push again this intuition that there's certain things that we take for granted as humans that we're able to do, but turn out to be really hard to engineer because, frankly, we don't quite understand how we as humans do it. We then moved on to the method section and trying to deal with the question of how do we study cognition? How do we get at this question of how intelligent behavior emerges? Where does it come from? So do we study the brain, which we know is of course highly involved? Do we study behavior itself? Or do we study mental states, which are these unobservable things like beliefs, thoughts, and so on? We mentioned that historically there has been an idea around for a long, long time that the mind and the brain are actually separate, even separate substances, that the mind and body are separate substances, and that for a long time people thought that intelligence has to emerge from a non-physical kind of substance because it just doesn't seem to make sense. How could some physical body, something made out of flesh and blood, produce something like intelligence? And Rene Descartes crystallized this idea in the 16th, 17th century with the idea of dualism, the idea that mind and body are in fact separate. However, contemporary scientific thought is that intelligent behavior probably can be understood in terms of the basic underlying processes taking place in the physical brain. So, in fact, in terms of understanding intelligent behavior, observable behavior, the idea is that we believe, or that scientists often would say that we believe, that it can ultimately be understood in terms of the processing of the brain itself. But how could that be? It seems very confusing to think how a physical system made up of a bunch of carbon and chemicals can produce something like beliefs and knowledge and so on and so forth, the things that we know of as mental state. And this was characterized in the short story that we mentioned from Terry Bisson that we saw a movie of. How can something like made out of meat, like a brain, produce thoughts, and how could it produce ideas? But ultimately, we do believe, or the contemporary scientific view is that the brain is ultimately the cause of intelligent behavior, which brings up the question of why do we need a different field called cognition? Why can't we just have neuroscience? Why not study the physical brain? And the short answer is that neuroscience studies the physical nervous system itself, and cognition studies the behavior that brain produces. That doesn't seem like a fully satisfactory answer. Why can't we, if the brain is ultimately what produces the intelligent behavior, why can't we study the brain by itself? And the answer is, first of all, that the brain is enormously complex with over 100 billion neurons, and with counting the connections between them, there are an absurd number of connections between them that are producing ultimately the behavior. And so it's just too complex a system to be able to understand given our current methodology. In addition, if you look at the structures of brains as we understand them, it's very hard to know just from what we know about, say, the macrostructure, what makes a chimpanzee different than a human. We can understand some bits about that they're made out of neurons. We can understand that they have a lot of structures that are actually very similar to one another. And clearly, of course, these different brains, such as chimpanzees or kangaroo brains, produce very different behavior. So, given the current understanding of neuroscience, it seems like we're quite a long ways from understanding how human intelligence emerges. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, brains are not isolated. Simply trying to understand the physical brain itself, as the neuroscience tries to do, doesn't take into account that the brain is embedded within a larger context. It's embedded within a body, which is embedded in an environment, society, a world. And if we're trying to understand things like beliefs about your friend, or knowledge about the class you took, or any other kinds of information that we may think of as mental states, we really need to think about it embedded within the context in which behavior takes place. Okay, so we need to study the mind. How do we do that? If we can't just study the brain, how do we go about that? And we've mentioned that there are several historical schools of thought on that. And we mentioned three: structuralism, behaviorism, and the cognitive approach, which is the contemporary view that we're covering in this class. Structuralism has basically was the idea that what you can do is look into the mind itself, that each individual has access to his or her own thought processes and can observe his own thought processes through this method called introspection. Observe how things are. If you can do that scientifically, you can break down the basic ways in which the mind is carrying out its processes. Problem with that is you can't verify or replicate, since nobody else can see exactly what's going on in your mind. If you say something is so, well, who am I to say you're wrong, and how can we prove whether one person's interpretation is correct or incorrect? So a basic problem is that it doesn't produce objective data that everybody can see and that we can verify and replicate. Another problem is that lots of processing takes place unconsciously. So, for instance, you may know how to ride a bike, but you don't maybe necessarily know explicitly have access to how to ride a bike. You may not be able to describe it, and this is true for many of kinds of processes that we have knowledge of implicitly, that we can kind of know how to do things. So, for instance, grammar as well. We know how to speak, but we may not have explicit knowledge of how our mind produces those kinds of behaviors. Behaviorism came along and said, well, all this mental state stuff is non-scientific. We've got to get rid of it. No beliefs, planning, or goals. We need to focus exclusively on stimulus and response, because those are observable. So all we can do is measure what the system takes in and what the system produces as an output, and we have to come up with a system for explaining the mapping between those, the laws that dictate which input leads to which output. A major proponent of this idea was John Watson, who was one of the founders of the school of behaviorism. Behaviorism started before John Watson in, uh, in a famous experiment by Pavlov and his dog, who came up with this idea of classical conditioning. And both classical, there's two types of learning that take place in behaviorist kinds of approaches: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning refers to changes in involuntary behavior. So in this case, the dog's salivation is an involuntary behavior. What happens in this experiment is that an involuntary behavior, which is normally tied to one kind of stimulus, say a food stimulus, can be paired with a new stimulus, say a bell, and then that bell can then produce that involuntary behavior. What's important about this, of course, is not how to train a dog to salivate, but rather the idea that organisms can ultimately learn complex associations, and what may seem like a complex kind of behavior and perhaps even an intelligent behavior may ultimately depend on this kind of learning. So learning to fear something, a gun, or learning to respond positively to, say, a good grade on a test may be based on this kind of classical conditioning. Watson showed that this kind of conditioning isn't only applicable to animals, but also shows up in humans. In the little Albert experiment, where a baby was trained to fear a small rat, which it normally was not afraid of, but was then, when the rat was associated with a loud noise, the baby ultimately became afraid of the rat itself, and even generalized to other kinds of stimuli. So the idea was to show that this kind of classical conditioning can take place in humans as well. B.F. Skinner, who was another major proponent of the behaviorist approach, introduced the idea of the Skinner box and operant conditioning, and here's where you can change a voluntary behavior based on stimulus response. So you can get a rat who normally wouldn't be particularly interested in pushing a lever to push a lever over and over again if you can give it an appropriate reward. And so this is a voluntary behavior. It's not like a fear response or salivation, but here's a particular behavior such as pushing a lever, and of course you can theoretically get a rat to do lots of things. Maybe it'll run on a wheel, or push a particular button. And the idea here is that we can now extend this not only to these simple kinds of involuntary responses, but to just about anything. So if you think about the range of human behavior, Skinner's idea was that things even such as language, producing certain language abilities, ultimately may depend on this behavior stimulus response kind of methodology. So what about behaviorism? Does it ultimately can it account for intelligent behavior? Well, there's some major advantages. The one, of course, primary one is that everything is observable and verifiable. It depends on stimulus response. These can be measured directly, measured objectively, so that everybody can do the same kind of experiment over again and again in their lab and determine whether the results are verifiable. And also, it proposes a simple mechanism for cognition. It just depends on learning. You just have to learn what kinds of actions produce what kinds of feedback, and that's how you get through life. That's how you learn to be an intelligent human being. And if in the nature-nurture debate, we would say this is very heavy on nurture. However, limitations on behaviorism is that ultimately you have to learn every single type of behavior. You have to learn its outcome. And this means that you can't generate novel kinds of responses under unfamiliar conditions. So we gave the example of walking into a room on the first day of class. You never produced that behavior before. How did you know that that was a good behavior to produce? You never produced that and got a food pellet or had some sort of reward. It seems that humans often engage in novel behaviors that end up looking very intelligent, but that they couldn't have been learned directly through a behaviorist type of approach. And as we mentioned, Alice, which was one of the chatbots that you did for your first assignment, was based on something similar to a behaviorist kind of approach, in that it depended on somebody programming in every single response to every type of stimulus. So any type of input somebody can think of, here's the response. But as we noticed, as we chatted with Alice, you quickly realized that Alice isn't all that smart after all, and that she can't really respond to novel kinds of things that novel kinds of information that she has not encountered before. Animals also engage in novel behavior. We saw this video of the dog jumping and using a flotation device to get to an object, what seemed to be a novel insight. And in the case of animals, some of the earliest challenges to behaviorism came from guy by the name of Tolman, who showed that rats in learning a maze learning task showed what looked to be behaviors that didn't really fit into the behaviorist approach. So in Tolman's experiments, a rat would first explore a maze that's in the leftmost column here, and did not get any food reward. And what was assumed to take place here is latent learning. So the rat is learning stuff, but it's not learning to produce a certain response in order to get particular feedback. Then the rat was placed in one arm of this maze and then would find the food down one of the columns. And so in this case, it learned that if it turned right down here, it would end up by the food. Then the rat was placed in a different arm, and when it got to the nexus in the middle, the question is, where would it go? And according to the behaviorist approach, it should turn right, which would end up in the wrong section and end up in D. But if it knew the maze, if it had learned the maze during the latent learning, then it should go to B. And in fact, most of the times, the rats went to B. And this only specifically happened when they had first been allowed to explore the maze. And what this suggested to Tolman was that when they were exploring the maze, they were doing this thing, building this cognitive map. And of course, this is a very non-behaviorist kind of idea. It's not learning a specific stimulus response. Rather, it's just learning information and storing that information, some sort of spatial information. Additional challenges to behaviorism came from Chomsky, who pointed out that in humans, language learning often shows learning or kinds of behaviors, language behaviors, that simply can't be learned in a behaviorist type of approach. So, for instance, coming up with novel sentences such as "I hate you, mommy," which the child could never have learned, but yet nevertheless can be used appropriately in the sense that they make sense given the context. And so, again, language learning in the case of children is another major problem for the behaviorist approach. So long-term legacy of these approaches, structuralism is not considered a valid approach. Introspection is not considered a valid approach because it doesn't produce verifiable objective data. But it is useful for generating theories. So introspection may be used for generating theories by looking into one's mind and thinking about how we do things. Behaviorism, the basic principle of measuring objective behavior, is still in force, and it's still an important application. For instance, in therapy, sometimes in order to reduce the fear response, it may be used. But importantly, we now do in cognitive approach discuss underlying mental processes. And this brings us to the cognitive revolution. This happened in the 50s and 60s. One of the major historical reasons for this was the advent of the computer. So computers, although they were quite primitive by today's standards, but they were first coming into the fore in the 50s and 60s. And here were thinking machines. These were machines that could do things like play chess or do complex computations, and they were physical systems. And the idea was, well, if a physical system like a computer can do something that looks kind of like thinking, maybe the brain, which is also a physical system, is also like a computer. And the idea then became to think of the brain as something like a computer, a symbol manipulation system. And this brings us to the idea of representation, which is the idea that a physical state of one system can stand for situations out there in the world. So this could be a boy counting the number of something that he's trying to keep track of on his fingers, so the fingers stand for those other objects out there in the world. Or, of course, it can be neurons in the brain standing for something out there in the world. And this leads to the idea of information processing, that like a computer, which has, say, states of its chips, electrical circuits in the computer, standing for information out there in the world. So too our brain and the neurons within our brain can also stand for objects or situations out there in the world. And there's ideas that they are symbols for properties of the world, and then processes over these symbols can lead to intelligent behavior. And what we mean by processes over those, we'll see a little bit more when we talk about that kind of neural computation. And ultimately, this idea is supposed to start to give us an insight into how we can have thinking meet. How can something like a brain lead to something like thought? And this yields the cognitive method. The cognitive method says the behaviorists were right. We need objective, verifiable data. But we're testing theories about underlying mental processes. So if we want to know what this guy is thinking about, we may use behavioral measures to do that. But we're ultimately going to talk about things like a belief or a reasoning or other kinds of underlying mental processes. An early version of the cognitive approach was an experiment by Donders, who did a simple experiment where he wanted to compare the time to detect a signal versus time to decide between two signals. And he noticed that it took longer to detect a signal, to decide between two signals versus detecting a signal. In this case, the measurement was just a reaction time. How long does it take to do one versus the other? And that's again objective and verifiable kind of behavior. But the underlying process that he was interested in is a decision process. And so that's ultimately something that we can't see directly, the decision. We can't see the decision being made by the brain directly, but we can infer that it's being made based on this objective data. And as we mentioned, the nature and how you represent information may have consequences in terms of how well you can do a certain task. So you can represent a number in Roman numerals or in Arabic numerals, but depending on which one you're using, it may be easier or harder to do something. So addition and subtraction are much easier to do with Arabic numerals versus Roman numerals. And the idea is with humans, as we can do experiments and test human ability to do certain kinds of things, and depending on what's hard or what's difficult, how long it takes somebody to do something versus how short it takes, this might tell us something about the underlying representation. And we discussed the example of mental imagery. So there's this basic question. We often feel like when we're thinking about something visual, thinking about how many rooms we have in our house, or thinking about a picture we saw, that we're kind of accessing a picture in our head. And then the question is that actually, this is an introspective kind of observation, is it actually valid? Is it true that there's something like a picture-like representation inside our head? And a guy by the name of Coslin did some well-known experiments that tested this idea. And he had people do the following experiment. They had to imagine a rabbit standing next to an elephant and then ask a question about the rabbit, or imagine a rabbit standing next to a fly and then ask a question. And what he found was consistently when the people had to imagine a rabbit standing next to an elephant, it would take them longer to make the judgment about the rabbit than when they imagined the rabbit standing next to the fly. And the theory was that just like a visual picture, an actual picture that you were to draw, that would contain a rabbit and elephant, the rabbit would be smaller. So it would take longer to make a judgment about the rabbit. And if it's a rabbit next to a fly, the rabbit might be larger. And so it's easier to make a judgment. It's easier to see that rabbit. And so this suggested that, in fact, mental imagery shares characteristics with actual pictures. We also discussed mental rotation, which was the topic of your second assignment. And what the observation here was is that if somebody has to do a comparison between two different objects, and one is a rotational offset compared to the other, the more rotational offset there is, the longer it takes to make that comparison. And we saw that in this graph here. And not only does it take longer, it takes longer in a somewhat linear fashion. Now, our data from our class wasn't quite this perfect and linear, but we got the same general trend. And what this suggests is that mental rotation is similar to real rotation. So just like in the physical world, if you have to match up two objects and you have to rotate them to match them up, it would take longer, and it would take, say, twice as long if they were twice as rotated. So too, this seems to be the case in terms of mental rotation. And so this suggests that the underlying mental process is similar to physical rotation. And so again, the idea here is that we're using a simple measure, reaction time, to get at something more abstract and complicated, suggesting something about the underlying mental processes. So that's, in summary, the cognitive approach uses objective behavioral measurements in order to determine underlying mental processes. As we mentioned, it's an underlying indirect type of science. It's often a far cry to go from the fact that somebody takes longer to do something or gets more or less correct in a task to saying something about the more abstract kind of underlying mental processes. However, for now, this is the best that we've got. Okay, now we move on to the third topic, which was the first lecture on brain structure. We start off with the question of whether we can use neuroscience to understand intelligent behavior. Now, of course, as we said, there's some limitations. We can't just use neuroscience to understand intelligent behavior, but that doesn't mean, of course, that neuroscience is irrelevant to understanding cognition. And so we'll look at a couple of different levels of the brain and see what they can tell us about intelligent behavior. The macroscopic, which has to do with the basic general structure of the brain, where things are in the brain, how it's organized, and microscopic, which has to do with individual neurons and webs of neurons, networks of neurons, and how they compute information. So we start with basic brain structure, And the idea is that understanding neural structure can help us understand cognitive structure. So what do we mean by that? Well, you could ask the cognitive question as to whether there are different kinds. How is information represented? Are there different kinds of memory? Are different kinds of memory represented differently? Say procedural memory, how to ride a bike, versus factual memory, say the names of people you know. Are there different kinds? Are they actually different kinds stored in a different kind of way in terms of their representation? Well, if we see that those different types of memory are subserved by different brain regions, then that might be a good hint that they are in fact functionally distinct, that they may be computed and processed differently. So if we look at the brain, we can define these anatomical divisions. So these are divisions based purely on the physical structure of the brain. So without knowing the particular function, you're able to divide up the brain into these anatomical divisions. And one of the major ones is the two hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere, which are quite similar in many ways, share a lot of the same structures. And these two hemispheres are further divided up based on these gyri and sulci. And so these are the folds in the brain, with the gyri, the ridges that are sticking out, and the sulci, the portions that are folded inward. And as we said, the cortex is essentially a flat sheet that's folded up, and this increases the surface area without requiring as large a skull. And so we don't want the skull to be too big because the baby has to get out of the mom, and in any case, we don't want too large of a head. And that's the basic function of these gyri and sulci. But they end up also, as we will see, having some potentially functional importance as well. In addition to these anatomical divisions, and the two hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere, are connected via this network of fibers called the corpus callosum, which is going to be important when we're trying to understand the difference between the left and right hemisphere. They are connected with a set of fibers. In addition to those anatomical divisions, further anatomical divisions are these lobes, and there are four lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal, which again are defined based just on anatomical structure, without regard to the functional purpose of these different lobes. In addition, we can divide up the brain based on functional divisions of the cortex. And as we will notice right away, there are quite a few more of these kinds of divisions, and that's because any anatomical structure, such as the sulcus and gyrus, may be further subdivided up into these different functions. So function, in order to understand function, we need to know what this part of the brain is doing. So we can't do it just based on observing its anatomical structure. This has to do with what those different parts of the brain are doing. So when we look at the two hemispheres, one thing we know in terms of the functional division is that these do seem to carry different functions, at least statistically speaking. So what this means is the left and right hemispheres actually carry a lot of the same structures and will also have a lot of the same functions, but there tends to be some dominance of one type of function in one versus the other. So the left is typically associated more strongly with language, and the right hemisphere is typically associated more with spatial kinds of abilities. So although there's many of the same structures, there's evidence of specialization, that the left is a little specialized for language and the right is specialized for spatial information. So how do we know all this stuff? How do we know about, in particular, the functional kinds of information? How do we know that certain parts of the brain have certain kind of functions? And we discussed several different techniques: cognitive neuropsychology, brain imaging, TMS knockout, and single cell recording. And so we're going to briefly go through some of those. So cognitive neuropsychology is the study of brain damage, disorders, and its effect on behavior, and it's the oldest form of information that we have about the function of different kinds of brain areas. So somebody comes in with a brain damage, and we can look at a CAT scan, for instance, and we can see a lesion. And so a lesion is where the brain damage takes place in a specific portion of the brain, and when we can correlate some specific part of the brain with some particular behavioral deficit, then that suggests that that part of the brain may be specifically involved in that. A famous case of this kind of functional localized behavioral deficit comes from Phineas Gage, who was this railroad worker who had a metal bar go through his skull. He survived and actually recovered a great deal of his cognitive function, but his personality changed. And we now know that this is probably because Phineas Gage had damage to his frontal lobe. And this, at the time, this was considered very shocking, that a certain portion of Phineas Gage's personality could change while the rest of his cognitive function was intact. But this is an early example of this kind of localization. And this leads to the idea of dissociations, the idea that what you can have sometimes is one type of cognitive function being preserved while another one is damaged. And it suggests that these are actually independent of one another, or at least strongly dissociated from one another, operate independently of one another. So if two functions are served by different neural mechanisms, this suggests that they may depend on different kinds of computational processing. A very good example of this is language. So language may seem like one thing, language processing, and understanding language, producing language. You might think that they depend on a single kind of processor. So our comprehension and production are the same mechanism. And so we've known for quite some time that different portions of the brain seem to subserve, seem to be involved with these different kinds of language facilities, so faculties. So Broca's area and Wernicke's area independently seem to subserve speech production and speech comprehension. And we saw that with these patients, the Broca's patient whose speech was very slow and deliberate, but it made sense. And so he had damage to Broca's area, and it seems that that has to do with speech production, but not speech comprehension. And then Wernicke's aphasia was quite the opposite. Very fluent speech, becoming nonsensical. So it seems in this case comprehension is limited. So Wernicke's area seems to subserve language comprehension and not language production. As a conclusion is that these two brain areas are actually doing different things. Different parts of language are subserved by different brain areas, and that speaking and comprehension are doubly dissociated. You can have one without the other in both directions. And that suggests language production and meaning are independent. And so again, in terms of the cognitive structure, so this tells us something about the brain, but it also tells us something about how language is processed and represented, and that these two seemingly related kinds of faculties actually are somewhat independently represented. Hemispheric specialization, so this idea that language and spatial abilities are differentially represented in the different hemispheres, first of all, comes from lesion studies. And so we mentioned that if somebody comes in with a stroke and is having language difficulties, the doctor will immediately suspect that the left hemisphere damage may have been done. And if he's having difficulty balancing or walking, then the right hemisphere may be suspected. We also have these very interesting but rare cases of split brain studies where people had their corpus callosum severed and produced really rather fascinating kinds of subtle behavioral differences that suggest this kind of specialization of the two hemispheres. Before we can talk about that, we just have to briefly mention the contralateral sensory and memory control and motor control in the brain. For reasons that are not quite well understood, the left hemisphere controls motor behavior on the right side of the body and vice versa. And similarly, the right visual field is processed by the left hemisphere and vice versa. And so we saw this patient who was a split brain patient who showed this very fascinating kind of behavior where if he was presented with information on the left side, so that his right hemisphere was getting that information, he would be able to draw what he saw, but wouldn't be able to say what he saw because language is supported by the left hemisphere. And conversely, if he saw the information on the right side, so that went to the left hemisphere, he would be able to say what he saw, but then when asked to draw it with his left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, he would draw something else. And so we saw examples where the two hemispheres and their specializations were kind of duking it out right there in real time. So neuropsychology, of course, as I said, has been an invaluable source of information for a long time, but the problem with it is that we can't do it proactively. We can't say, let's see what this part of the brain does exactly across lots of different patients. We have to basically take lesions as they come when it comes to human behavior, human participants. So we move on to non-invasive kinds of techniques that don't require brain damage, such as fMRI. fMRI is a technique that's gained a lot of prominence in the past 10 to 15 years or more. And what it does is, non-invasively measures blood flow to certain regions of the brain while somebody is performing a certain kind of task. The basic assumption here is that blood flow equals processing. If you're seeing more blood flow to a certain part of the brain, then that part of the brain may be particularly important in the kind of activity that person is doing. A basic technique in terms of fMRI is not measuring where is there activity in the brain. As we said, there's activity across the brain during almost all kinds of mental activity, but rather it's measuring differential activity using the subtraction method. So you record where there's more activation in relation to some particular activity versus some other. And typically uses a block design, and I apologize for the formatting of the text here. And so block design, because blood flow is kind of slow to build up, this hemodynamic response as it's called, you need to show a bunch of trials of one kind of thing and then a bunch of trials of another kind of thing. So let's say you're looking at faces, you may show a whole bunch of faces and then a whole bunch of other objects, and then you look at which part of the brain may be involved specifically, the faces over that epoch, that block where they were looking at faces. So advantages and disadvantages. Some advantages are non-invasive and has better resolution. fMRI is much better resolution than previous technologies which we didn't discuss, such as PET. But it's very poor temporal resolution, so you can't see things in precise timing because the hemodynamic response has to build up over time. Another point is just because a brain region is more active doesn't mean it's the only region. So the idea that we could say, well, this part of the brain is the region that's doing face processing, well, lots of other parts of the brain are also active. And it only tells you where and not how. So, perhaps the biggest criticism of or limitation of these kinds of techniques is just knowing where things take place and that they take place in different regions still doesn't tell you how this actually happens. EEG is another kind of technique for measuring brain activity. In this case, measures electrical activity on the scalp, and that's due to the action potentials which depend on electrical conductivity, and that electrical signal travels up through the scalp. And what EEG is really good at is measuring things with much better temporal resolution. So you can measure things rapidly. It's able to measure these changes over a small amount of time. So, for example, in this particular one, this is a waveform. So this is electrical activity. You see a spike at one point, 100 milliseconds, and then a drop at 170 milliseconds. There's something called the N170. This actually is a response specific to faces. And so this is happening at 170 milliseconds after stimulus presentation. And so you could say, look, we could see that the brain is processing this kind of stimulus by 170 seconds. It's already showing a differential response. So it gives us very good temporal resolution. It tells us we're able to make judgments of how fast the brain is doing something. So some advantages are, as we said, better temporal resolution than fMRI, but much worse spatial resolution. By the time that electricity gets to the scalp, it's already depends on the activity of a very large number of neurons. And again, we still only know when and a little bit of where, but we still don't know how these things function based on this technology. Another technique, a more recent, is TMS. And what TMS can do is it can actually, well, it's more recent, at least in terms of research purposes. TMS can do is knock out portions of the brain in terms of their electrical conductivity using pulses of electromagnetic radiation. And what this does is it allows us to say if we knock out a portion of the brain, then there may actually be some behavioral ramifications. And so you knock out a part of occipital lobe, you can actually induce something like blindness. And what's particularly cool about TMS is that it allows us to make these kinds of causal claims. So it's not just about this brain portion is more active, but if we take out this portion of the brain from functioning, it actually limits the ability to do something that really shows us that this part of the brain is critically necessary to do this kind of function. Overall, we said there's some warnings about claims. All this stuff about brain areas is a very slippery slope. In many cases, it can be abused. We don't really have a good understanding of what these kinds of localizations mean, exactly what it means to say a certain brain area is more active than another, and yet that doesn't stop people from making very large and sometimes absurd claims on the basis of this. Things where they'll say that some portion of a brain area lining up means something or another, and it's just safe to say at this point that those kinds of claims are often very premature. Single cell recording is the most precise rather spatially precise kind of information you can get. You get a single neuron and its electrical activity in terms of action potentials as an organism is looking at a certain kind of stimulus or being stimulated somehow. And so it's very precise. You're getting one neuron's precise specific information. So you get very precise location information, but this raises the question of whether neurons can be understood in isolation. What does one neuron's response? We now move on to the second lecture on the brain, and this concerns microstructure of the brain. So we come back to the idea of representation of a physical state standing for something out there in the world. In the case of the brain, well, of course, the idea is that neurons and their states may represent information about the brain, and operation over those symbols can produce something like intelligent behavior. So how does the brain represent the world? Neurons are ultimately cells, as we said, cells like skin cells and other body cells, but they're specialized in that they are able to receive and transmit information within the nervous system. Remember, we mentioned information processing. So the basic idea of a neuron is it gets input by the dendrites, and typically via dendrites, and then transmits information through an action potential through the axon, and then outputs information through the axon terminals. So the chemistry of this is complex, but the principle is simple. It's input and output. Input in terms of neurotransmitters changing the action potential firing rate, then reduce the release of neurotransmitters at the axon terminals. Action potential is this firing, the special kind of electrical activity that takes place in the axon and then sends information to another neuron. Release of transmitter then takes place and then affects the firing rate of the receiving neuron. Although they're awfully close together, two neurons do not actually touch. The axon terminals and the receiving neurons, dendrites, are actually separated by something called the synaptic cleft. And that's where those neurotransmitters are released, and then they will bind with receptors on the receiving neuron's dendrite, and that changes the firing rate of the receiving neuron. Nervous system wiring, we have the CNS, central nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is where information is brought from the peripheral nervous system, so the senses, the sensory receptors out there in the periphery will bring information to the spine and then to the brain, where it's further processed. We discussed three basic neuron types: motor neurons, sensory neurons, and interneurons. And the receptors or sensory neurons get their information from the physical world, and so from the senses, touch and sight and auditory, and then send that information on to the CNS and to the brain. Motor neurons take information from the CNS carried out to the body by virtue of stimulating the muscles. And then association and interneurons are by far the most common neurons and make up the entire brain. And those receive information from neurons and send information to neurons. So just to take a closer look at a receptor or sensory neurons, receptor and sensory neurons do something special, which is transduction. The receptor takes information in the form of physical stimulation, so it could be pressure that's taking place on a pressure-sensitive receptor in your finger, or it could be a light-sensitive photoreceptor, and turns that into a neural signal. And we can think of this as a representation of a property of the world, how much pressure is being placed, or the shape, or the texture of an object as it produces pressure on a single sensory receptor, is a representation of some property of the world. If we look at the basic pattern of activity of a neuron, what happens is as a sensory receptor gets activated, it will produce typically a greater number of action potentials. And so we can see this oscilloscope in this case measuring action potentials as they travel across the axon, and as this particular sensory receptor gets stimulated, you see a frequent burst of these action potentials. And just to further demonstrate this point, this is supposed to characterize a photoreceptor. It's receiving light signal, and as more light comes in, you get a more frequent response. And a point of this is that the size of the signal is constant. It's about this all or nothing action potential, but it's the frequency with which it happens that matters in the end in the brain. Motor neurons are these specialized cells because what they do is they output to muscle fibers and cause those muscle fibers to contract, and that's what controls body. So that's what controls body movements, and that's what makes motor neurons different. They get information from the CNS and then send it out to the behaving body through the muscles. Interneurons, as we said, speak to one another. They both receive and send information to other neurons. This raises the question in the case of the interneurons is what good are they doing? What's this brain for? If all it does is get information from neurons, send information to neurons. And the answer is that it's performing this thing we could think of as neural computation. This is the beginning of our understanding of what it means for a physiological, biological system to do something that we might think of as approaching or approximating intelligence. So we're going to talk about a couple of different ways that the nervous system does neural computation, and we're going to talk about convergence and the interaction of excitation and inhibition. Convergence is when many neurons converge on a single neuron. Interaction of excitation and inhibition, so a neuron can both excite and inhibit another neuron by the release of its neurotransmitters. And we use this example of a light stimulus of a certain size, and we were looking at a characteristic firing of a specific sensory neuron. In this case, the sensory neuron is neuron B, and we're going to look at its firing rate. And B is wired up to some of these sensory receptors up here. And so in this example, let's say the light bar is only stimulating neuron number 4, receptor number 4. B is going to respond with a certain amount of frequency of firing. And then if we extend this out here, if these are excitatory connections, 3, 4, and 5 are now all converging on B. So this is convergence, and B is going to respond more vigorously, so more frequently, because it's getting more excitation. If we go out to make this a larger bar of light, it's not going to affect the firing rate because these aren't connected to B. But if we do connect them up to B through these other sensory neurons that are now also converging on B, so A and C are now converging on B, now as we make the bar wider, it's going to increase the response rate. And then the interesting thing that happens is when we make these inhibitory, so A and C are now inhibitory on B, and then we extend this out here, it's actually going to have a reduced response. And that leads to the idea that B has a favorite response, which is a bar of just this length. Anything less and anything more is going to produce a reduced response. And so now you see that this little neuron B is now doing something that looks a little bit more sophisticated. It's not just responding to how much light there is. It's not even responding to how large the bar of light is. It's responding, so it doesn't just like larger versus smaller, but it's responding to a specific size of a bar of light. And this is the idea of feature detectors. The idea is that neurons can respond to specific features, and Hubel and Wiesel discovered certain neurons in the cat cortex that responded to specific oriented bars. And we saw a movie of one of those neurons. And you could have an oriented bar, you can have an oriented moving bar, and so these neurons are now doing something that looks kind of smart. And it's a single little biological cell, but it's doing something that looks kind of like detecting or representing a specific feature of the world. How specific do neurons get? Well, in fact, neurons have been found in monkeys that respond specifically to faces and not to any other stimuli. And this suggests that neurons can get really quite specific in the type of feature that they can represent, type of object they can represent out there in the world. In fact, in humans, recent studies have shown that there are neurons that respond to specific individual people. In this case, the Halle Berry neuron, as it was called, in one patient was found to respond specifically to pictures and names of Halle Berry, and there was another one of Jennifer Aniston. And this suggests, if we want to think about the idea of representation, that we really have some examples of particular neurons symbolizing individuals out there in the world. And this gets into the question of just how specific neurons really get and whether, in fact, the way the brain represents information is by specific neurons standing for specific objects or people out there in the world. And this idea of specificity and coding, again, I apologize for the text. And the idea here was that perhaps there's individual neuron that responds to Bill and only to Bill, another one to Mary and only to Mary, and so on and so forth. An alternative interpretation of these kinds of observations is that what happens is not that one neuron only responds to one person and one person only, but rather there's an ensemble of neurons that all respond. But it's the pattern of activity across a large ensemble that represents whether you're seeing Bill versus Mary. So perhaps there are neurons 1 through 3 are all responding to Bill, but they're responding in a certain pattern in terms of which one is more or less. That's different from the pattern in the response to Mary. And there's some good reason to think that grandmother cells, the specificity encoding idea, is probably not true, because it seems highly unlikely that they would have found this particular neuron out of 100 billion that responds specifically to Jennifer Aniston or to Halle Berry. And in general, we don't find that even though neurons die, and neurons die all the time, we don't find people losing the ability to think about or talk about or recognize specific individuals while everything else is preserved. So it's unlikely that specificity encoding in that simple form is true. Something more likely, more like ensemble coding, is probably correct. A larger point here is that it's not just about bars of light, oriented bars at specific faces. The idea is that by pooling together lots of different features and converging information from lots of those features onto individual neurons or into ensembles of neurons, we can theoretically have the brain identify or think about or represent just about any object or property or concept you can think of, as long as it's made up of features. And so in order to identify a motorcycle or a bicycle, you can think of a bunch of feature detectors of these lower level features converging on these, and then if you have excitatory and inhibitory kinds of convergence, you might be able to differentiate between a motorcycle and a bicycle. But of course, this is just an example of what could be a much more general process for representing information. We now move to the final topic, perception, and this is chapter 3 in the textbook. So we start off with the question of what perception is for, and as we point out, there are at least two basic underlying functions of perception. One is recognition. So this we can think of as offline perception, where you're not doing something specific, but you're just recognizing what objects are in the world, versus action, visually guided or perceptually guided action, such as avoiding obstacles or picking up an object. And both of these we need perception in order to do both of these kinds of things. We start off with the observation that sensation and perception, although related, are two different things. So sensation is what your sensory system does. We talked about sensory receptors. So there are sensory receptors underlying the five senses: touch, smell, seeing, and hearing, and taste. And what these sensory receptors do is take measurements of the environment. So it may be measuring chemicals in the air in the case of smell or taste. It may be measuring pressure or heat in the case of touch. Maybe measuring light in the case of vision, or maybe measuring vibrations in the air in the case of hearing. But this is not perception. As I said, perception takes place in the brain based on these stimulations, these measurements. Our brain has to make inferences, guesses about what is causing those specific measurements, what's going on out there in the world, which is what we ultimately want to represent. Some examples, for instance, we may have pressure and heat on your hand, and based on that you may interpret that as someone else is touching your hand. So the basic measurements are of pressure and heat, and the interpretation is of another person touching it. We can see that perception very often depends on guessing, that it's indirect, that there's a gap between the sensation and the perception. So for example, we see a circle behind a square in this case, but of course that's not the only possible interpretation of what this is, but there's a certain sense in which our brain will tend to generally make certain guesses over and over again. In this case, we say the sensory stimulus is ambiguous. It's ambiguous whether what's actually in this scene here. In this case, the ambiguity, as we saw in many illusions, is one of depth, is where's the circle and where's the square, which one's closer or further away in depth. and the perceptual system makes a best guess. And as we said, in this case, the reason it's a best guess is because there are lots more circles than there are these kinds of Pac-Man shaped wedge objects in the world, so there's more likely to be a circle. And also, the edge of the Pac-Man, if that's what it was, so something like this, and the square would have to be perfectly aligned. It seems much more likely in some sense that there just happened to be a square somewhere in front of a circle. So this is actually a reasonable guess, and this, in general, what we're going to find is that the perceptual system is making what we consider a best guess based on the considerations that it has at hand. So a particular example of the ambiguity, of the inherent ambiguity of a stimulus, is lightness. Trying to figure out whether if something's black or light or white or gray, when we see it that way, what that is, whiteness or grayness or blackness, has to do with how reflective an object is. So if something's black, it reflects much less light than something that's white. And the question is, how does our brain figure this out? When you see an object or something or a patch such as this one, how does your brain know that this is gray? So the naive answer would be just measure how much light. If there's a lot of light bouncing off of it, maybe it's white. If there's not a lot of light, maybe it's black. The problem with this is that there's inherent ambiguity because you don't know how much light is in the environment. And as we pointed out, a white object under poor lighting is going to reflect a lot less light than a black object will under good lighting, say natural light. So just measuring how much light is bouncing off of it isn't going to tell you whether the thing is actually white or black. It's not actually going to tell you how reflective it is. And we didn't actually discuss in any detail how your brain does actually solve this, but the point is that your brain does ultimately make a guess. And we can see that it's guessing from these illusions. So in this case, A and B are really the same reflectance. They're actually reflecting the same amount of light, and that's coming into your eye, but you see them as different for various reasons. Your brain interprets them as different. You can see they're the same when you connect them. And your brain is basically making an inference and saying, well, yeah, this is reflecting the same. It's right now it's producing the same amount of light as this, but this one must be more reflective because this one's in shadow, and if it's producing the same amount of light, then it must actually be a lighter kind of surface. And so what your brain does is make an inference here, it makes a guess that this actually has a lighter reflectance than this one does. And in this case, it happens to be wrong. So illusions are these cases where your brain gets things wrong based on the kind of inferential processes, the kind of guessing mechanisms it has that usually work. And so the brain usually gets perception right. But in the case of illusions, they're carefully crafted to show the underlying assumptions that your brain is making. So we start with the basic structure of the eye. And what I want you to know about the eye is just that light has to enter through the pupil and then reach way back into the back of the eye into this thing called the retina. Light enters the pupil, is focused by the lens, and this lens is something that just changes how the light ends up in the back of the retina. And the retina is made up of these photoreceptors. So these are kind of sensory receptors, which means they do transduction. They change light into a neural signal. There are two kinds of photoreceptors, rods and cones. Rods are highly sensitive, which means that they need less light in order to be activated. And they have lower spatial resolution and do not have achromatic, which means they don't respond differently to different wavelengths of light, so they can't tell the difference between different colors. Low spatial resolution means that they are basically kind of blurry, that they can't do fine level detail. The cones have lower sensitivity, need more light, a higher resolution, they can make finer detailed precise measurements, and they're chromatic, they can measure the differences in wavelength, and so that corresponds to differences in color. In general, rods are more active in low lighting conditions, such as nighttime, and cones are more active in better lighting conditions, such as the daytime. So what does the retina tell the brain? Well, it's got all these rods and cones. It's got about 100 million per eye. And what they ultimately deliver to the brain is a matrix of numbers, measurements of how much light of what wavelength is hitting the eye in different locations in the back of the eye. So you start off with that, but of course what you really want is something like this. When you see a room, you want to be able to see where the objects are, where does one object begin and the other end, segmentation and grouping, where are they in depth, and to recognize what the objects are. And as you can see, it's a long, hard task to get from one to the other. To start off with just a two-dimensional description of a bunch of measurements of how much light and what color that light is, to being able to figure out these more difficult kinds of features of an environment that you really want to know. So how do we do it? There's two basic types of processing that we can discuss. Bottom-up processing and top-down. Bottom-up processing is based on the stimulus itself. So regardless of what kind of stimulus it is, there's certain kind of processes you can do based on the information in the stimulus. Top-down processing, on the other hand, depends on the existing knowledge of the particular type of stimulus you are looking at. So you may know something about it based on the stimulus type that's not necessarily there just based on the bottom-up information, the data in the image itself. So we talked about some examples of this for segmentation. So let's say you see a grid such as this one. You can do bottom-up segmentation. You may not know anything about this, but you may be able to segregate these on the basis of common regions. So if there's similar texture in one place and then that texture changes, you may segregate those up and carve those up into different squares. This we call bottom-up segmentation. You don't have to know anything about it in order to do this kind of segmentation. Another kind of bottom-up segmentation is edge detection, looking for places where luminance changes. This is very important. It's something that we see already in the retina taking place. So places where light suddenly changes from light to dark or dark to light is often going to indicate that there's actually a change in the reflectance, and so that means maybe the object has changed. So it's a white object on a black background. So those luminance edges, as you can see over here, are very important in potentially signaling that there is a change in the object that you're seeing. So edge detection is a form of bottom-up segmentation as well. As you can see, it's certainly not perfect. There's portions of the image where there are edges that you don't see, and then there's lots of edges that aren't really edges, aren't really object edges in any case, object boundaries that you do see. So you need to also employ other kinds of strategies, for instance, top-down information. The Dalmatian, which you, if you were in class, you hopefully recognize here, is an example of top-down segmentation. Once you know what a Dalmatian looks like, you may be able to segment out edges that aren't really there based on the bottom-up information. This is because you're bringing top-down knowledge. It's not based on some generic process you can run or based on the data and the information in the image, but rather you're bringing knowledge to the scene that's allowing you to do that. We also talked about sine wave speech, which was another example of where top-down information can change the way you perceive sensory stimulus. In this case, the auditory stimulus sounded very different when you knew what it was going to be because you already heard the real original version of it, and made the sine wave speech sound very different. And it's another example of top-down information. Once you've got your edges, you also need to figure out, there's something else you need to figure out. You don't want them to know where the boundaries are, where the light-dark boundaries are, but you now need to figure out the depth ordering of those edges and which portion of the image the edge is a boundary of. So you could see this either as black objects, black faces on a white background, or a white object on a black background. So this is a next step after segmentation that your brain needs to solve, and we can see it's again based on the ambiguity of depth. So if it's black faces, then the black is in front of the white, and if it's a white vase, then the white is in front of the black. So how do we go about solving these? In most cases, how do we actually do this kind of figuring out segmentation? So we talked about a couple of cues: symmetry, convexity, parallelism. Let's just talk about the symmetry one. So there's a tendency here to see the black as figure on a white background and not white as figure on a black background, although it's possible to see that. And we said that bias arises from the fact that in general there tends to be a pretty high proportion of objects that have this kind of symmetry, so that's present if we see the black in the black objects. And so when faced with the possibility of black symmetrical objects and white asymmetrical objects, we tend to see black symmetrical objects. So we do the figure ground segmentation based on this property of objects. And as we said, it's not just that there tends to be objects that are objects often tend to be symmetrical, but it's also that it's very unlikely to have symmetry between objects. So let's say it's white as figure. Well, we would have to be a very special kind of arrangement of white objects that would lead to this kind of symmetry between their boundaries, and that the brain seems to think is just too strong a coincidence. It seems much more likely that there are in fact black objects that have symmetry rather than white objects that are asymmetrical that happen to be perfectly aligned to produce this kind of symmetry. So the point is that the brain is doing something, making an inference based on symmetry here that probably works in many cases. It's probably the right thing to do in terms of figuring out which one's object and which one's background. We also talked about grouping and Gestalt principles, which are rules for connecting image regions together. So we were talking about segmentation before, segmentation and figure ground, but figure ground assignment And in general, there's a larger problem of putting pieces of an image together that belong together. So we talked about the desk, for instance, that continues behind the chair in that image before. And again, it's based on best guess techniques like figure ground assignment. And these some Gestalt principles that have been known for a long time are laws of similarity. So in this case, you're more likely to see this as a row of squares and then a row of circles because the squares are similar to one another. And why is similarity a good thing to use? And is because objects themselves will often have more similarity within them than between different objects. So if you look at an object and you take measurements of different parts of that object, they're more likely to be more similar to one another than if you take measurements from amongst different objects. Another one is proximity. Again, we tend to see these as grouping, not these. So the horizontal versus the vertical. And again, it's because parts of objects tend to be closer together to one another than parts of different objects. Gestalt principle of good continuation. We would tend to see this wire continuing past this way for a smooth curve. And again, it's because it's a reasonable assumption. It seems to be a reasonable assumption that this is a property of objects that they tend to have smooth curves, that this would in fact be a single object rather than some object branching off in various different directions. And we talked about common fate, where portions of an image move together. This also leads to them being grouped together. Another basic problem, now beyond those that we've talked about, is that of depth ordering. So specifically processing depth information. So the image on a retina, as we said, is 2D. It is a two-dimensional image. It's a flat sheet of retina. And so the question is, how do we figure out how far things are away from us? And as we said, many of the previous problems we discussed to some extent fall out of the problem of the fact that we don't have direct depth information. So how do we figure out how far things are away from us? So we mentioned a couple of basic cues to this, just to give a little flavor, and there are many such cues that have been discovered. So occlusion is one. If one object is blocking another, in this case, the blue is blocking the red, there's a fair assumption to assume that that object is actually closer to you than the other object is. We also talked about perspective projection. The fact that an object is that the light from an object has to pass through the small pupil before it gets to the retina leads to this thing called perspective projection. And one property of perspective projection, one effect of this perspective projection, is that as an object gets closer to you, the image on your retina is going to increase in size. And so your visual system can use the increase in size in order to figure out just how far away an object is from you. So as we can see here, your visual system does actually use this as a depth cue. When train tracks recede in the distance, they look like they're converging. And the reason they look like they're converging is because the image of those as they get farther away from you is smaller on your retina. So further away equals smaller on your retina. In this case, of course, it's an illusion. This is really a flat image. But your brain interprets the fact that these are getting further away, not that they're actually converging, that they're actually joining together, but rather that they're actually further away from you in space. So your brain is using the fact that it knows that when things are further away, they get smaller to make an interpretation here that these are receding from you in depth. Size constancy is the fact that derives from the fact that our brain knows that when something is producing a smaller retinal image size, that could be because it's smaller, or it could be because it's further away in depth. And size constancy occurs by when your brain is able to interpret the fact that something is producing a smaller retinal image as due to it being further away in depth rather than it being actually smaller. So if we show the actual same image of this guy, but over here where this thing appears to be in the same depth, your brain is now going to interpret this as a much smaller man. But it doesn't look like a much smaller man when it's further out here, because your brain says, oh, the reason that's producing a smaller retinal image is because it's farther away. So it could actually be a similarly sized man to this, but just farther away. And so again, this demonstrates that your brain is able to use its knowledge of the fact that the retinal size is smaller as it gets further away in order to interpret this thing as being farther away in depth. We did not discuss binocular disparity, so we will not be covering that for this exam review. And the final topic, and still this is part of Chapter 3 in the textbook, is Perception 2, which deals with recognition and also perception in action. So what do we see in a moment? There was a movie that was shown in class which showed briefly presented objects, pictures of objects. They were able to recognize, even though they were presented for less than 100 milliseconds. And so this is a very brief presentation, and yet you're able to recognize those objects. So we're really good at recognition. But recognition is actually really hard. So the best state-of-the-art technologies are not able to recognize these kinds of texts. And even though we as humans can recognize them and read them fairly easily, so the best algorithms can't match human performance. Again, like other things, even though recognition seems kind of easy to do, it turns out to be quite hard to automate. What is recognition? So recognition is recognition, and the idea is that we have some stored representation of objects in memory, and then when we see a stimulus, we try to match those to that stored representation. The question is, what is the nature of the representation? And so again, it gets into this question of the underlying representation. The simplest form of a representation, a model, for recognition would be a template model. So if you have to learn to recognize a K, then when you see an image of a K, you store an exact replica of that and then match up some new version of the K to that one. And the problem is, although this is very simple, that it's going to break, it's very brittle, it's going to break very easily. So if you just rotate a K and you have to recognize that, which of course we can do, it's going to fail because it's not going to exactly match. So if you're thinking in terms of just storing an exact replica of the original image, the template model, it's going to be very not robust in relation to any changes in the image. And so this is the basic problem of recognition, is that there always are changes. There are lots and lots of changes that happens between when you originally see an image and the next time that you see it. Some obvious types of changes are changes in viewpoint. So as something rotates, oh well, that didn't work, it's going to look very different. So as an object rotates in space, the image that you're going to see is very different. Variability among members of a category, so there are lots of different types of Ks, and you can recognize those all as Ks, even though the images they produce are very different. This is true for other kinds of categories, so lots of different kinds of houses. You can recognize them all as houses, but you may never have seen these examples of a house before, so you have variability within the category. And individual objects change, so people age, such as Bill Clinton, people change their shape based on moving their limbs, and people change their faces based on changes in viewpoint. So this is a rotation depth, but also in this case, changes in facial expression. And yet we're able to recognize this all as the same person. So what is this representation that we have that allows us to match all these individual inputs to the same underlying representation? So feature-based recognition suggests that what we do is use features that remain stable across variations. So these are all faces, they're all different, but there are certain similarities. In this case, there's various features that are common across all these different examples of faces. And so feature-based recognition for something like letter recognition may say, well, what we're going to do is look at features that are common across all these. So all of these Ks have certain kinds of diagonal lines and certain kinds of straight lines. Don't have any horizontals, don't have any of these curves. And we say, oh, there are those features that are common across all these examples. And so in order to recognize a K, we look for those features that remain stable across different kinds of Ks. One of the most prominent examples of a feature-based theory of recognition is Geon theory, which suggested that the way we overcome changes in viewpoint, so things look different depending on the angle at which we're viewing them, is to extract these volumetric geons, volumetric parts, which can be recognized from different angles based on specific properties. And so in order to recognize a phone, we just need to know that it's made up of a number 5 geon, a number 2 geon, and a number 3 geon in various relations to another. What is special about these geons is, again, that they can be recognized from various viewpoints because there's certain properties, certain features which remain stable across changes in viewpoint. So, for instance, this kind of cube is always going to have a straight edge and a straight axis, which is always going to be present regardless of which viewpoint you view it from, and so on and so forth for all these different kinds of geons. View-based models, on the other hand, are different than feature-based models. What they suggest is that, well, it's not based on certain features that are constant across different changes of viewpoint, but instead, in order to recognize objects from different angles, what you do is you actually have to see them from several different angles, and then there's ways to extrapolate to novel angles based on having seen it from a couple of different views. So this is basically something like a template model, but we can think of it as a template plus. It's templates. So you're seeing a couple of different views, and then you see a novel view. You're able to extrapolate from those views to this new view. So which one is right? Do we use geon theory? Do we actually? How do we recognize things from different viewpoints? Do we use those features that remain constant across changes in viewpoint, or do we do it based on having had a couple of views and then extrapolating to a new view? So one important prediction of geon theory is that recognition should be viewpoint independent. As long as you can extract those geons, you should be able to recognize the object equally well and just as fast as if they're regardless of the particular viewpoint at which you see them. So again, remember we talked about different representations leading to different predictions as to what's easier and hard. In this case, geon theory makes the prediction that it's going to be just as easy to recognize an object from one viewpoint as another viewpoint. But empirically, we find this is not the case, and so view-based theories predict that it might be more difficult to recognize an object in this viewpoint than this viewpoint, because what you've stored up is a view such as this one, and in order to recognize this one, you'd have to do something like, say, mental rotation to get to it. And in fact, empirically, what we say is that it takes people less time to recognize this object, an object under this condition, under a canonical viewpoint, a familiar viewpoint, than an unfamiliar viewpoint. So this seems to suggest geon theory might not be the right account of recognition. Besides these feature-based models and view-based models, we also have to recognize the role of top-down information in recognition. So as we said, once you know there's a Dalmatian here, you can recognize it, and that's true in this particular example as well. You might be able to recognize individual letters based on your knowledge of English words. And so it's important to take into consideration the role of context, and this is a form of top-down information in visual recognition. And we saw this example of the many personalities of a blob, so it's the same image in all of these examples, but based on its context, it's going to be recognized as something different. How do we do this? Well, there's some good evidence that people store up information about what kinds of objects tend to be in certain locations. And so in a certain study, people were able to identify what object is likely to be in a certain location, even if they had not ever seen it in that location, based on their general knowledge of the schema and which kinds of objects tend to occur in certain types of situations. Finally, we talked about the visual brain. So the brain is made, what we think of as being visual areas are spread out across a pretty large portion of the brain, at least 30 visual areas, taking up over half of cortex. So that's a good chunk of cortex being devoted or involved in visual processing. And so what are all these different visual areas doing? Well, one thing we know is that there's all these different visual areas are processing information in a somewhat hierarchical fashion. What this means is information starts off fairly simple. So if you look at neurons in the photoreceptors in the retina, they respond to very simple kinds of stimuli. And then if you look at early cortex, so it's a little further along in processing, so that the retina sends its information to cortex. Well, those neurons are going to respond to more complex types of things like oriented edges. And then further along in the visual brain, as the information converges even further into different neurons, you get higher degrees of specificity and higher degrees of complexities, complex shapes. And then eventually you get neurons that respond, as we said, to faces and also to objects. And so what you get is this further refinement and further complexity of processing as you get further along in visual areas. So that's what all these visual areas are doing. They're doing further and further processing of that original information. There's good evidence that these higher level areas are involved in this kind of specialized kind of processing, even from fMRI imaging. So there are these portions of the brain that seem to respond selectively to faces. And so in fMRI experiments, in a facial recognition task, you'll have this region called the FFA, fusiform face area, that seems to respond characteristically, specifically to faces. And additional evidence comes, again, from neuropsychology, from cases of people who have some sort of damage to portions of their brain will sometimes show these specific kinds of agnosias And these are particular inabilities to recognize certain kinds of objects, such as faces in prosopagnosia or objects in semantic agnosia. And you saw the video of the prosopagnogic. And importantly, these people are certainly able to see and they're able to process to a high degree most of the visual information, but they show these very kinds of narrow disabilities to recognize certain kinds of objects, and it suggests that this is really a specialized kinds of processing taking place in higher level regions of the brain. However, as we saw, there is some debate exactly what this kind of specialty processing really means. So is there really a face area in the brain? That FFA, it does respond to faces, and it does damage, if it gets damaged, it does affect facial recognition. But there is some suggestion by others that it's not specifically about faces, but rather the kind of processing that is required in order to recognize faces. So faces tend to look similar to one another, and maybe what this portion of the brain does is actually recognize things, is distinguish between things that are visually similar. And what evidence there is for that is a study by Gautier and Tar, in which they trained people to become Greeble experts. These were novel objects that were visually similar, and they learned to distinguish between them. And then they put them in an fMRI, and lo and behold, their FFA, that region of the face that's thought to be selective specifically to faces, was now responding. And so some people have suggested this is an expertise area, not a face area. And this is a general controversy whenever we see a certain part of the brain that's lighting up. If we don't know exactly what it's doing, we just know it's responding to certain kinds of tasks, then there's going to be some debate as to what exactly makes it specialized for that kind of task. Finally, we talked about the dorsal and ventral streams in terms of the structure of the brain. We know anatomically that the visual information that comes into the occipital lobe gets sent dorsally upwards to the parietal and then ventrally downward to the temporal lobe. And the question is, what are these different portions of the brain doing? So there's two theories. One is the what versus where theory by Archuleta and Mishkin. And they showed in monkeys that if one removes the temporal lobe portion, so that would be the ventral stream, then the monkey who has that done will have difficulty distinguishing between two objects. So that's meant to be a what kind of system. If, on the other hand, you damage the parietal lobe, so the dorsal stream, they may be able to distinguish between two similar objects, but they won't be able to do a task which requires saying where an object is relative to another. And so that's the where system, the what versus where system. An alternative explanation into the dorsal and ventral stream is the perception versus action dichotomy. This has been proposed by Goodell and Milner based on some interesting observations of patients that they have. So, for instance, this case is a patient who has damage to a ventral but not dorsal portion of her brain, and she's very poor at doing a perceptual orientation matching task. So this is what you can think of as sort of a basic recognition perception task, saying whether a line has the same orientation as another. But she's quite good at picking up an object and pushing it through a slot. And in order to do that, you have to know the orientation. So when she has to do a visually guided action, in this case, that seems to be largely preserved. And so that suggests that perhaps the dorsal and ventral subserve different kinds of processing: recognition, perception on the one hand in the ventral, and then perceptually guided action in the dorsal. And the last thing we discussed was the fact that recognition and the senses in general have long been thought to operate somewhat independently of one another, but it turns out that they interact quite a bit. So when you hear a voice, for instance, it automatically conjures up an image of a face. And it gets even more dramatic when we look at speech recognition. So if we have to recognize what sound a person's making, if there's a visual cue, a video of a person speaking a different sound, that can actually interfere with the sound that you hear. And that's the famous McGurk effect, which occurs when a person is speaking, visually speaking the sound ga, and you hear the recording of the person speaking ba. You end up hearing neither of those, and you end up hearing typically, at least most people will end up hearing something that sounds more like da. And so the idea is that the brain actually doesn't just separately process visual and auditory information when it's doing recognition. It actually can combine these sources of information. So the final conclusion is that recognition can depend on complex combinations of information that can be multimodal from different sensory modalities. It can be a combination of top-down versus bottom-up information. There's no single algorithm to recognition.